Dialogic Disciple is an invitation to explore discipleship in dialogue with the world as disciples of the Word. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dialogic Disciple Podcast. My name is James Johnson and I am here with my co-host,
Elizabeth Shavy.
Elizabeth, we have another special guest with us this week.
Woo!
Michael, introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. This is Michael Devine. I'm the Director of Music Ministries here at Northside.
We had one of your, we had your Associate Minister Director in last week, Joshua.
Yeah, he shared some interesting stories with you all. I listened to the episode.
He told us a little bit about how you guys met and your experience at Wheaton.
The only accurate thing that he shared is that I definitely could only handle 1 year of organ lessons.
I'm going to give you the chance to rebut anything that he said. Michael, thank you for being with us this morning.
Absolutely. Good to be here.
We are here to talk about Love Divine, All Love Excelling.
There's no family connection.
I was going to ask you about that. But let's start with a little bit about who you are, what you do here at Northside Church, and how you got into the ministry of music the way that you are right now.
Well, I think first of all, he's gotten all of us spelling the word divine improperly. At least I do now. So
actually, my autocorrect corrects to Michael's name.
I direct the adult choir and festival choir here and then administer the rest of the music program for traditional worship here at Northside. Have an amazing team that I get to work with and both planning worship and executing worship and just having a lot of fun praising the Lord.
How long have you been here now?
Almost 7 years.
Wow, yeah.
So,
holy number.
Yeah.
Correct.
Number of completion.
Nope, that won't be the case.
Good. That's good to hear.
We'll have to find another holy number for that.
we got 10 and 12 and 40. It's still
Yeah,
out
there you go.
so.
You've got a sanctuary restoration to oversee.
Yeah, that's been a fun, I'm not going to call it a project yet. I'm going to call it a fun conversation so far.
Right, yeah.
Do you want to? Can you say anything about that right now, as far as how that process started and
Yeah,
what we're looking at?
I shared with the trustees about 1.5 years ago just about sort of the poor condition of our pipe organ, which was installed, speaking of years of completion, it was installed 40 years ago, and just it has some long-lasting problems that need to be addressed, and that has sort of snowballed into wider conversation about the accessibility, usability, acoustical nature of our sanctuary, how it can be used sort of for the next generation, next legacy here at Northside for worship. The trustees commissioned a sanctuary restoration team, a committee to continue that conversation. We're working with a few different consultants. On the side, Joshua and I have been traveling the country, actually, seeing churches that have gone through this process, seeing pipe organ installations, seeing what could fit well for us here at Northside.
Oh, that's
So
awesome.
cool. What is the typical lifespan of a pipe organ?
Oh boy, that's a tricky question.
I was installed 40 years ago. There's some issues that I need to address as well. So
Rather than saying what should be, I'll answer it in what we hope our next organ lasts, sort of looking to the future. Our hope is that whatever project we do serves Northside as a community for 80 to 100 years.
Oh, wow.
So something that far outlasts any of us today.
Nice.
And it's something that generations will look back on
except
and
for
say,
Glenn Warren, he'll be here apparently.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Shout out to Glenn.
Still listening to this podcast.
Well, that's fantastic. That's great. Now, so the whole project started as basically just as a pipe organ.
Yeah, just sort of looking.
Pipe organ dream.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at the pipe organ, seeing, okay, this is a problem. How are we going to address it? And it has turned into sort of a more holistic, how do we want to worship, really, for the next century here at Northside?
That's
So
awesome.
other than a pipe organ that will outlast all of us, what is your biggest hope for that space within this project? Like, what is something that is going to be like the biggest positive outcome for that space? Because I think a lot of people, they hear sanctuary restoration and you just think like, oh my gosh, they're going to rip down this amazing stronghold of Northside and they're going to totally it's going to be completely different. It's not going to look the same. My sanctuary, I think there can be a lot of anxiety around that conversation. So what are some positive things?
A lot of screens and banners. And
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
All the things.
It's all fear.
Projectors.
Well, it's and I think to that point, it's people's home. It's people's spiritual and worship. It's the place tangibly here on earth that we say this is. I mean, for us as Christians, not to overly spiritualize this, but to really contend with Scripture here. this is our coming to the temple to
Yeah.
worship. And then suddenly we're talking about, doing any semblance of change. That's not just a scary conversation, but it's a serious one.
Yeah.
I remember one of the previous churches I served, to contextualize just my experience in this conversation. One of the previous churches I served had done some work to its altar area right before I arrived. It's the only thing I ever knew and saw at the church, and so I thought it looked quite beautiful. Still do. And there was so much controversy in the church around this, and people started talking about what they really thought of this altar change, and they even would sort of show me pictures of what it looked like, and don't I wish it used to look like that. And I mean, to be very honest, again, since I was brand new, I didn't know any better. I would see photographs of the old altar and be like, well, that just looks ugly. Like, why would people be wanting that?
Right.
And then a few weeks later, I was at a choir member's home for dinner. I was walking down a hallway in the house, and I saw 1 photograph, 2 photograph, 3 photograph of her wedding, her daughter's wedding, and her granddaughter's wedding.
All at that altar.
All at the same altar. And I went,
Yeah.
oh, that's why this is controversial.
Yeah.
So there's context to what does it mean to talk about people's spiritual home, to talk about their temple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rather than talking about specific changes that I hope happen, I sort of am trying to think about this and lead conversation with others in more broad philosophical terms. Anything that we do here at Northside, we want to be about restoring and not renovating, in part because we want to talk about longevity.
Yeah.
We want to talk about maintaining what we have. One of the words I keep hearing over and over again is the warmth people feel when they walk into our sanctuary. So what does it mean to retain and restore that going into the future? 2025 is the 75th anniversary of Northside. I don't know if this project will be done by then or not, but what does it mean to talk about the next 75 years of Northside Church? So I think about this basically in 3 big, broad terms for me philosophically. One, we want everything we do, and first priority is about enhancing what Sunday morning worship looks like, feels like, and what the experience of the space as a worship service space is. Is anything and everything we're doing and discussing about enhancing and improving what that means, what it means for Methodist worship specifically, how Methodists worship has changed from when our sanctuary was built, and how we use it today is different than when it was built. How do we wrestle with some of those questions? The next thing, this is a little bit practical for me personally, but in terms of how the sanctuary is used for the large-scale music events that we do. For people that have come to Festival of Carols, you've seen us shoehorn a lot of people up there. And it's tricky. I mean, we are using every square inch just about of that area. So how can we reconfigure things so that it's more usable? And then the last area, which also comes to me back to that whole restore word, when across the street from us was not Sutton Middle School, but Northside High School. It was the arts magnet high school for Atlanta Public Schools.
Oh, wow.
Is that right?
I did not know
And
that.
Northside was often used as sort of their concert hall.
Oh, wow.
And it's not used in that anymore. It's now a middle school.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of reasons why, understandably, that relationship doesn't exist. But I then kind of think back to what would it mean? What does it look like for Northside to be an arts venue in and of itself?
Yeah.
Oh, how wonderful.
On the south side of Atlanta, there's Spivey Hall at Clayton State University, which is sort of a mid-sized venue with good acoustics and a pipe organ and a good stage for music. On the east side of town, Emory University has their concert hall. Same thing, mid-sized venue with a pipe organ and a stage for music. And then you come to the center or the north end or the west end of Atlanta, and suddenly that space doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And I kind of go, what would it mean for Northside not only to have a space that's great for worship, great for doing our own large music events, but suddenly a great space for the community to come
yeah.
Wow.
and do,
What a great way to reach
and
out.
do the arts.
Yeah. I was at a conference yesterday down at Emory talking about leadership and things like that, and we were talking about Ezra chapter 3, where folks are coming back out of exile and the process of rebuilding the temple and what that's going to look like, and how there are people who didn't go into exile and who had lived generations, now a couple generations, without having the temple, and they kind of just figured it out, and they didn't really want a temple anymore, and so they were kind of mourning this whole, or weeping and lamenting this idea of rebuilding the temple, and the whole process of like, do we build it the same way it was before? How do we restore the importance of temple worship and what the purpose of the temple is, and then still listen to the voices of those who want something new and something that's completely different? I think Northside is special in the way that we can accommodate a wide spectrum of worship needs or wants, desires. But that whole idea of temple worship, I think, is
well,
a key
and
piece.
Directly coming from Ezra and other passages of Scripture, while we can't necessarily take a lot of tangible one-to-one passages in terms of construction of worship spaces out of the Old Testament to today, how does the pomegranate get sewn onto the tapestry? We're not going to take those specific instructions.
I want a recreation of the Ark of the Covenant.
And go watch Indiana Jones.
I'll get Top Men on it. Top Men.
I mean, it's got to exist somewhere in Nevada, right?
Yeah.
But the one thing we can take from those passages of Scripture, while we may not be able to take the exact tangible, okay, this is what needs to be built or sewn or constructed here, we can take two important words, which are excellence and sacrifice.
Yeah.
What God demanded, what he specified, what the nation of Israel built was exceedingly excellent. It was beyond anything that could almost be imagined in a religious ritual sense in that day. In addition, it took a great amount of sacrifice of and by the people to accomplish. Interestingly, in an American context, or just in a Western context generally, those are two words we really struggle with.
Yeah.
What does it mean to build something excellently when we are a fast food culture?
Yeah.
I mean, I went to Starbucks this morning, got my disposable cup, What does it mean to give and build not just of your means, but maybe beyond your means sacrificially? These are two things that we struggle with, and that are the consistent call of the Old Testament upon the people. They struggled with it.
Yeah, they did. I think on top of that too, just thinking from the Western mindset you're talking about is not just sacrifice of means, which is right on, but also sacrifice of opinion and sacrifice of personal preference and things like that. And what does it look like to do something like this as a community? Thinking about the next 75 years, not just the community that's here now, but the community that stretches into the future.
Right. How do we think about serving them?
Yeah. That's really good.
Man.
You said you have consultants coming in. I think you mentioned to me one time there's a theological consultant or somebody who understands theological architecture and things like that. Can you talk about that at all?
We have two different consultants that we've been working with. One that we kind of started the conversation with on acoustics. She's known around the nation, if not around the world, for her work in acoustical design here in Atlanta. And actually, Joshua and I did not know this when we contacted her, but here in Atlanta, she's got some big projects, including Cobb Energy Center.
Oh, wow.
She did the Short Center at Emory. She's done stuff at ASO. She's doing work at Westminster Schools. So she got relationship with Atlanta. But you meet her, so kind, down to earth. And then you get talking to her about what her own musical experience is, and she sings in her church choir.
Yeah.
So here's this renowned acoustician that understands what it means to do worship in church.
Yeah.
And that's been just a fun contact point in the conversation.
That's cool.
Her name's Dawn Schutte. She's with Threshold Acoustics in Chicago. In addition, we're working with a gentleman named Terry Eason out of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Okay. And similarly has a very impressive resume of work, ranging from helping churches think through what it means to build a new baptismal font, all the way to helping Episcopal and Roman Catholic dioceses conceive of and then construct a new cathedral. Wow. For anyone that saw any of if anyone saw any of the funerals of George H.W. Bush or Barbara Bush down in Houston, Texas during the pandemic, St. Martin's Episcopal was designed by this gentleman.
Oh, wow.
So, and And then in addition, he loves doing restoration projects, sort of what we're doing here. He's even done it and helped guide his own church through this process of thinking through, how is your space used? How should it be used? What are the theological implications of having an altar or a communion table in this location versus that location? Having the choir situated. How do you want the congregation interacting with the space? And he's shared a lot of information just about the construction of our church that I didn't even know. Our chancel is modeled after the approved 1924 Methodist Episcopal Church of the North plan. So, and that plan sort of filtered down to the south, even before the merger of the denomination in the 60s.
Wow.
But our church has roots in something.
Yeah.
And what are those roots? Why are those roots?
Yeah.
Those are great questions for us to discuss.
It's such a fun project.
Yeah.
I just love two things that I love about this, like the idea of telling and honoring the story of what we have here, and as a communications person, I want to be really intentional about doing that as we move forward through this and bringing our congregation along in this process, and helping people to understand why we're doing this and what are, like you're talking about, the philosophical energies behind it, because it just makes it beautiful. But then the other thing too that I really appreciate is this idea of the excellence in these people, that are dedicated to what they are doing, and they are learned in what they're doing, and they just pulling all of these, all of this. Excellence. That's the word, right? Pulling the excellence together for the glory of God.
Yes.
And in the arts, in everything that we do here. To direct our imagination for God's glory. What an incredible thing.
One, not to make a book plug here, but one book that I've shared with several members of the committee and a couple other folks along the way is a very short book by Phil Ryken called Art for God's Sake. And it's it's a brief little primer, really, in looking actually at some of those Old Testament passages even, but also just looking at art in general and saying, what does it mean to do this and be a part of doing it for God's glory? I've shared with a few folks that in many ways we're talking about a very big, very expensive art project. What does it mean to do something that not only lasts beyond us and lasts for the next generation? Those are great words, don't get me wrong. That's vocabulary I want to continue using. But what does it mean to do it for the glory of God? And how do we frame the conversation in our thought process around that?
And I think the better that we get at expressing those things through excellence, the closer we draw to God. If we, because like you're saying, this can get touchy, right? Because especially when it comes to something like art, there are opinions involved. Like, what is beauty? What is right? What is good?
Been asking those questions for 2,500 years.
Right. But if we can set aside our opinions and think about how the expression of these things helps us deepen down towards God, I think it becomes a holy process and not an opinionated process. It doesn't have to be a divisive process. It can be a community thing, like you're saying. You used that word earlier.
I think getting back to that excellence and sacrifice is a good way to think about that. I'll make another book plug. I have a book over there on my shelf by Marva Dawn.
Oh, love her.
Royal Waste of Time, which gets into the same kind of thing that you're talking about. Well, it sounds like it's a very thoughtful and prayerfully led process. It's just beginning. We hope get blessings upon it. And
thank you.
As people who are committed to Northside, we are excited to see what's going to happen. All right, so let's shift to our hymn for the week. Dr. Bill preached on hymn 384 from the Methodist hymn book, Love Divine, All Loves Excelling. And Michael, you picked this one, I assume because it had divine in the title. I'm not sure, but I'm going to let you start by talking about why did you pick to come on this week, talk about this hymn, and what do you love about this hymn, and did Bill get the message right when he preached about it?
I think I've been enjoying both last week and this week how he's gone through stanza by stanza. I know you mentioned last week, 4,000 things to sing. Hard to do all 18 stanzas in one sermon.
Some of them are.
But Love Divine is just a 4-stanza hymn text. He's able to preach through all of it. and this is one of my favorite hymns, just as it is. I will admit this is not one of my favorite hymn tunes.
Okay.
It is probably the most widely published hymn tune with this hymn text, at least in the United States. It is not sung almost at all in Great Britain. And the reason I say that is when it comes to English hymns, we often sort of compare English and American resources in terms of historical value and merit. As is typical, I'm not really sure. I'm not sure if there is any record. I've actually looked and couldn't find any of what tune Charles Wesley would have expected this to be sung to.
Okay.
Even this is about, probably about 100 years, 130 years separation between the tune that we're singing to when Charles Wesley wrote this text. The other two hymn tunes that are primarily sung are Welsh tunes. Not really sure when they were written. They were actually written down even later than this, in the late 19th century, early 20th century.
Oh, wow, okay.
And that's the tune Hyfrydal, which is what we sing, Come Thou Long Expected Jesus, for those that know that Christmas tune, Come Thou Long Expected Jesus. So this would be sung, Love divine, all loves excelling. And then the other famous tune that's Welsh, and I say famous now especially because it was done just yesterday at the Queen's funeral, is a tune called Blenrhen, and it's Love divine, all loves excelling, joy of heaven to earth come down. Has another
I
sort
like
of
that. I've not
Welsh,
heard that one.
Welsh lilt to it.
Yeah.
One of my favorite tunes, one of my favorite pairings for this text. So I just have some, musical, poetic reasons why I like it.
Yeah.
I like how it fits. I think the message of this hymn is a little, I don't want to say unusual, but it's really, it's a prayer hymn. And it's not, it's a supplication that doesn't so much, ask almost as much as it simply declares. This is what is going to happen, and God, this is what you're going to do. Not in a presumptuous way. I think it's done in a poetic tone of reverence, but it's a declarative hymn. And what's interesting in terms of the history, and again, this is speculative, but you begin looking at the resource and going, okay, speculation makes sense. Famous composer during Wesley's own time was Henry Purcell. Is a lot of his music's been forgotten, and certainly in the church context, but wrote a lot of operas at the time. And there's an opera text that some folks feel like Charles Wesley might have been trying to Christianize in the same way that sometimes Christian things were satirized in the opera world.
Absolutely.
So let me read you what Purcell and the poet John Dryden wrote for this opera, King Arthur.
Okay.
I would prefer if you sing it, but
Well,
I'll take a reading as well.
don't know the music, so you have to deal with the reading. So this is what John Dryden, Henry Purcell set. Again, and this is their opera, King Arthur. Fairest isle, all isles excelling, seat of pleasures and of loves. Venus here will curse her dwelling and forsake her Cyprian groves. The same meter applies, and you have this phrase, all excelling. At the end of this little aria in the opera, you get this line. When all thy mercies, O my God, my rising soul surveys, transported with the view, I'm lost in wonder, love, and praise.
Wow.
look
Does
at
that remind you of anything? Till we cast our, John West, Charles Wesley then closed, till we cast our crowns before thee, lost in wonder, love, and praise.
Oh, that's really cool.
So interesting, sort of in the same way that oftentimes the musical world would satirize the Christian world.
Yeah.
You had this moment where Charles Wesley is almost sort of turning the tables.
Yeah, that's really cool.
On the musical world with this hymn text.
That's really cool.
There's an interesting history is probably too strong a word, but as all is often the case, hymn texts take on a little bit of their life of their own over the course of time. Denominations fiddle with the language here, fiddle with the preposition there,
absolutely.
and this is a hymn that actually will vary slightly from denomination to denomination.
Really?
It is almost never noted in the bottom, and actually, this is a moment where Methodists have messed with Charles Wesley.
Oh, no. Controversy.
So, if you look in stanza 2, we have in the third line, take away our bent to sinning.
Oh,
Alpha
yeah.
and Omega B. Charles Wesley originally wrote, and it is actually published in most hymnals, take away our love of sinning.
Interesting.
Sometimes denominations will tweak our to the, so it's take away the love of sinning. And again, these are maybe nitpicking small little grammatical
But it could
details,
change.
but
That's
they do change the theological
Yeah.
grit of what's
Absolutely.
going on.
Do we know who made that shift?
I
It's-
do not know, unfortunately.
That's interesting.
But it's not the only hymn. I mean, this is a common thing where in part to reflect the theological moorings of the moment,
Yeah.
denominations will make slight changes to hymns. Sometimes they are noted if they're big changes.
Yeah.
Once you're dealing with a public domain text, you can kind
You
of
can
do what you
whatever
want.
do with it. Yeah, absolutely. But just to talk
so-
about that one change there, I mean, this is this. I guess what we've done here is try to make this sound like more like John Wesley, and a little less like maybe what Charles is trying to get at, which a little Lutheran, little Calvinist,
Yeah,
maybe.
Charles was a little bit more effusive, let's say,
Yeah.
with his theology. Yes.
Yeah, because the love and bent towards sinning. That's I think that's a big difference.
Yeah.
I would like to say that I'm bent towards sinning, but not that I love sinning. But I do, so maybe, maybe the love is more correct. Wow, okay.
Well, regardless, I think the closing line of that stanza, which is that faith sets our heart at liberty,
Yeah.
Regardless of its being bent or loving, we have the promise and hope of Christ here at the end of the stanza.
We still got sanctification to look forward
Yes.
to. Yes. So you said this is one of your favorite. Why?
It is.
Is there a particular reason?
I wish I'd say why.
Just love it.
It's a tune, the various tunes. It's a text that's always sort of in the forefront of my mind. It's one that I enjoy setting and putting in worship. The way it was included actually yesterday in the Queen's funeral is
Yeah.
interesting. In that it's oftentimes difficult to talk about the word diversity in a white Christian context.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? In part because diversity means so many specific things right now.
Absolutely.
But from, again, a wider historical lens, by singing at the closing of the English monarch's funeral, a Methodist hymn text set to a Welsh tune.
Yeah. There's some intentionality there.
That actually presents a profound statement of diversity
Yeah.
for the head of the Church of England.
Wow, yeah.
To put at the end a Methodist
Yeah.
hymn set to a tune by the Welsh. So there's Queen Elizabeth was involved in the planning of her service. And
Of
course, right.
She knew stuff like that.
I was going to say that's not an accident. Nothing like that is.
And
yeah.
yet, it was robustly sung. Like it was sung and hung onto by the people.
Wow. I'm curious. You know more about this than I do. Probably more than most people. When Charles Wesley wrote this, he was Anglican, right? He is part Church. So, do you know this? If any of his hymns made their way into an Anglican context in his own lifetime?
Oh, in his own lifetime, I don't know. I mean, the likelihood is yes, because oftentimes these hymn collections were just being cranked out. I mean,
Yeah.
we think about today, hymnals sort of having a lifespan. Part of that is also a uniquely American invention, where we have a hymn book that's got 4 parts, musical parts written for everybody with all the text, and this giant book. It's in our pews. Here you go.
Right.
That wasn't even common in the United States until the turn of the century.
Okay.
It still is not common in Great Britain. Most time, if you go to an English church, the hymn book will be something that's almost looks like pocket size compared to this.
Yeah.
Because all it contains are words.
Really?
Sometimes there might be a little melody line without any text even, but just a little melody line written.
Wow,
But
okay.
oftentimes it's just a book of words. The organist then plays through whatever hymn tune they've selected to go with that text. and they'll play through the whole hymn, and then you sing. But the notion of the direct pairing of text and tune, certainly 4-part harmony, it definitely comes from a Lutheran influence in American churches.
So it's more like a Psalter kind of situation where you just have the, and then
Yeah.
yeah. That's
Similar view. I mean, I have worshipped in King's College Chapel, which doesn't get a whole lot more, drippingly Anglican than King's College Chapel of Cambridge, and their hymnal is a word book.
Yeah.
Wow. What does that say about the expectation? Because my first thought is like, does that mean that whoever's putting ours together thinks it's more likely that the congregation can read music versus in that setting where you're not given music because you can't read it? But that doesn't seem to really actually make sense. I don't know what is the thought process behind that?
First of all, I think expectations change over time.
Yeah.
I think in that setting there's an expectation that people probably have some sort of corporate knowledge of the tunes.
Okay, that makes more sense.
Which also is a bit presumptuous, of course. At the same time, an expectation that people are going to listen with their ears to be like, okay, that's the melody. I can sing that.
So it's more of an active. You said they play through it,
Yeah.
and you're actively teaching it and learning it in that space before they sing it.
By presenting a 4-part harmony, that's also expecting that a congregation could then sing in 4-part harmony. There are very few
Right.
that
Yeah,
can.
I mean,
very few of those that can that do. So the practicality of having a congregation have their voices unified in song, unified in melody, is perhaps a bit more practical. The other key word I just use is practical. When the printing press was first around, having anything printed was a lavish expense.
Yeah.
Sure.
So you're going to make it as small and compact as possible.
Yeah,
Makes sense.
yeah.
And
That's fair.
that sort of careful stewardship never really changed.
Yeah.
And so
Okay.
there was
Whereas
sort
in
of like,
America, I have this leather-bound hymnal book.
right.
Right. And you can't even read the music.
I have no idea what this,
Yeah,
this is
right.
Latin to me.
I thought you spoke a little Latin.
I do actually. So maybe that's not it's math to me.
Yeah, there we go.
That's fine. Did I? This is neither here nor there. I guess it kind of connects. But did I read somewhere once that John Wesley, maybe Charles too, but John Wesley had a aversion to harmony in music, like he didn't.
Oh, I don't know. That'd be fascinating.
That just popped
to me.
into my head. So maybe
it wouldn't surprise me if you said that of Calvin.
yeah.
What was Calvin had an interesting perspective on music in the church.
Yeah.
He believed very strictly in psalm singing, and in the one of the collections of the Geneva Psalter that he oversaw, it was of course all psalms except for a single hymn at the front of the hymnal that he wrote. So, so yeah, we all have, I think, moments and opinions, and just
Yeah.
like us today, our church forefathers, their minds changed over time.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
But yeah,
Yeah.
if there was an aversion to harmony, I think where I would even like think about that today is again in the context of what does that mean for the people to be united in song.
Yeah.
Part of what makes having soprano, alto, tenor, bass helpful oftentimes is it means people can sing in an area comfortable for their voice.
Yeah.
When you have a situation where that training is not as active, having a melody that all people can sing is then the next
Right.
best thing that we can offer.
Right.
So
That makes sense.
Yeah. Another reason I really love this hymn is it applies to so many facets of not just life, but so many facets of the life of the church. In our hymnal, it is in the Sanctifying and Perfecting Grace section on rebirth and new creation. And makes sense. There's a lot of that language within this hymn. But I have also heard it sung, and when you begin unpacking this a bit, you go, oh yeah, wow, I've heard this sung as an Advent hymn. Come,
Really?
Yeah, love divine, all love's excelling, joy of heaven to earth, come down.
down.
Fix in us thy humble dwelling. all thy faithful mercies.
Well, now it just
crown.
seems obvious.
Right.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah.
And yet I'll admit, even since I've been at Northside, when's the last time you've sung this at Advent? You know?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
I've not yet planned it as an Advent hymn. Maybe we will this year.
Yeah.
And then there's also this, and Bill mentioned this, there's finish then thy new creation,
Yeah, this is
pure
my
and
favorite
spotless
one,
let
yeah.
us
Yeah.
be. There's an eschatological view to the future.
Yeah.
Where do we end our lives? We end our lives in praise. We end our lives in heaven. We go there. And in a similar fashion, I would argue that's also a big part of the message of Advent.
Yeah.
So I love how this hymn text in and of itself just transcends the church calendar.
Yeah.
In ways that not all hymns do. And that's not the purpose of all hymns, don't
Yeah.
get me wrong. But this one really does it and does it well.
That's excellent. I had never thought about this as an Advent hymn before, but it does.
But
seem
you're right. The
obvious
second you start
now.
reading it, yeah. Come Almighty to deliver.
yeah.
I mean, yeah.
And verse 3 does the direct line from the incarnation to the cross in about 2 stanzas.
Yeah,
Or two sentences, excuse me.
Kind of like the Apostles' Creed does.
You know?
Born of a Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate. There's a lot in between those two events.
They just skip it.
We just kind of
They
skip
just
it.
skip it. Ridiculous.
We won't get into creedal formation today. So when you let me how do I ask this question? You are somebody who is not only musically trained, but theologically trained. And when you're drawn to a hymn, whether it's this hymn or other hymns, are you drawn to the music or the words, the theology, or is it, or you can't tell the difference anymore? Is it?
That's a fair question. I think it depends, unfortunately, oftentimes how I first hear it and first encounter it. There are times when a tune will really catch my attention.
Yeah.
And then I may not necessarily care actually for the text that is with that tune. There have been times when I've tried to put other tunes and texts together that maybe I think fit, where the tune serves the text in a different way, or the text aligns with the tune a little bit better than maybe it was originally put with it. So I enjoy the sort of that exercise and being captured by one or the other. I would say in the course of my own growth in faith, texts have certainly started to grab my attention more and more than tunes do. Looking at the grammar, looking at the syntax, looking at the vocabulary. Why is a poet choosing to frame things this way? You also begin to realize, especially with some of these good hymns, Bill mentioned Charles Wesley wrote between 6,000 and 9,000 hymns.
Insane.
Right.
We only have a few in the hymnal.
Right.
There's a reason for that. There's only a few that sort of stood up against the test of time. And part of why they've stood up against the test of time is, boy, do they distill a lot of theology really quickly in beautiful ways.
Yeah.
Hymns are fundamentally poetry. They're not music.
Right.
They're when we sing them, we are bringing 2 art forms together.
Yeah.
And you need both of those art forms to be good.
Yeah.
You need good text with good music coming together. And thankfully, our hymnal represents about 500 years of that work in action. And the Wesley hymns are a part of that.
I'm sure that you run into this many times where you will try to take a hymn and use a different arrangement and a different tune or different song, different music, and people are like, that's sacrilegious, or no, that's you have tarnished this great hymn.
Well, it's interesting. Even this past Sunday, we sang "Love Divine" out of the hymnal, and then one of those Welsh tunes I mentioned, I had the choir sing as the introit and as the choral benediction at the end of the service, just as another version. And then Joshua, as his postlude, played the third version of the tune. So we tried to sort of, pepper this different musical offering in the midst of things. But I remember the first time I even just had the choir. This is a year or so ago. We sang an alternate version of Love Divine, and somebody's like, I never heard that. I don't. That's not how Love Divine goes. And part of the real answer is, well, Love Divine for its first 130 years didn't go how we sing it either.
Right.
So these things change. And there are sometimes when those fit really well, those changes, and sometimes where they don't. I mean, the reality is, hymn tunes and hymn texts, there has to be a marriage between those two things.
Yeah.
it is possible to sing Joy to the World and Amazing Grace to one another in terms of how the metrical settings work out. But it would make no emotional sense to go, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. I mean,
Okay,
that takes away the solemnity of
Right.
that text.
What that's about, yeah.
Nor would it make any emotional sense to sing Joy to the world, the Lord has come.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any emotional
Yeah.
connection to the text itself.
So that's an interesting. You bring that up. That's interesting because I'm wondering if music plays such a huge role in a memory formation and spiritual formation in ways that we don't even realize. It gets into our hearts in ways that bypass the brain a lot of times. And I'm wondering if there are Amazing Grace is, I think, probably a good example. That Joy to the World, maybe too, where those two, the tune and the words, are so melded together now that they couldn't be separated.
Yeah.
Well, that is one thing that I think is really cool about what y'all have been doing in these services is singing it to different tunes, because I know sometimes, like you're talking about, it gets so melded in your head and you just sing it and then all of a sudden you hear it. And for me, I grew up singing one tune to this, but when I hear you guys sing it another way, I pay attention to the words more.
Sure.
Because it catches you and suddenly you're listening in a different way, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not to give away anything you'll talk about next week with Tiffany, but this coming Sunday, Soldiers of Christ Arise. And we sing that in our hymnal to the tune of Crown Him with Many Crowns. And so inevitably, while we will be singing that text, and as a tune people will know and can sing easily, they'll have Crown Him with Many Crowns in the back of their mind. And it's an interesting, juxtaposition of those two things together.
That's fascinating.
That is cool.
I want to learn more about this. Time to go back to school.
Hymn tunes, hymn texts. I think, you mentioned part of our memory formation, even more specifically to us, our spiritual formation. Music, the act of doing music. So I'm not talking about the act of listening. I'm not talking about the act of looking at music. Not even the act of writing music, but the act of doing music, singing, playing an instrument. Performing in some capacity is one of, if not the only activities that neuroscientists have identified as a global process of the brain. Everything from breathing to writing to thinking in different capacities is clearly a left or right brain activity, except for performing music, which activates the entirety of the mind. So the command from Scripture to sing and make song,
which is the most repeated command in all the Bible, by the way.
And it's one that we can just sort of be like, okay, God said it, we should do it. And yes,
there's no controversy.
That's
there.
That's a great reason. That's a great reason. But then if we begin to, especially with all the scientific tools that we have today, to be like, why is that a good command from God? Like, why is that good for us? Part of our spiritual formation as musicians, because if you are a Christian, you are a musician. If you don't think you can sing well, guess what? You are a musician. Part of that is the activity of the global process of the mind. It develops the whole mind.
That's really
good. It develops the whole spirit.
I read that somewhere where music therapy, that's why music therapy in coming back from like strokes and stuff is so important because of that global processes. I like that. Also, that's the quote of the day. If you're a Christian, you're a musician. I like that a lot. That's a good mantra to take with you. Every voice of a believer sounds like an angel in the ears of God, right? I like that.
Or it will someday.
Or someday.
Right, exactly.
It's all music training. Well, Michael, thank you so much for
welcome.
Joining us today. This was a fantastic conversation. Any final thoughts before we go?
Thank you. Always love being here.
All right. Well, we'll look forward to hearing what's coming this Sunday in worship. And thank you again, Michael.
You're welcome. Thank you.